Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down into the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In storm and rain, voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In storm and rain, sorrow and pain, still will remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing.
We light our chalice now, and we're so pleased to welcome Ian Mraz as he lights our chalice this morning, and then as we say our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is our covenant. I invite you to sing together now. Do you hear?
Do you hear, oh my friend, in the place where you stand, through the sky, through the land? Do you hear, in the heights on the plain, in the vale on the main, in the sun, in the rain? Do you hear, through the roar, through the rush, through the throng, through the crush? Do you hear in the hush of your soul, Hear the cry, fear won't still. Hear the heart's call to will. Hear a sigh, startling trill in your soul, in your soul. From the place where you stand to the outermost strand, do you hear, oh my friend? Do you hear all the dreams, all the dares, all the sighs, all the prayers? They are yours, mine and theirs. Do you hear? Do you hear?
Some years ago, my dad was in failing health and had to come be with us in our home for a period of time. When the weeks wore on and the strain began to take its toll, our dear friend Connie Roudebush offered to come one afternoon to do some caretaker relief for us. Now, Dad was a man of few words, but Connie managed to get him to talk for several hours about his life experiences and opinions. Connie had a knack for doing that. After she left, Dad said, "That was a real nice lady, but she sure did talk a lot." The fact of the matter was that Connie Roudebush practiced active listening. She proved the adage that a good listener is a great conversationalist. For me, active listening is relatively easy in a friendly conversation. It's not too hard to ask open-ended and follow-up questions. However, I find I don't do as well in situations where someone and I disagree on something. My tendency, all too often, is to stop really listening and to slip into debate mode where rebuttal and counter-argument prevail. When I do this, there are actually two voices I'm not listening to. One is, of course, the individual with whom I am debating, but the other is my inner voice. Let me explain. It's a deeply held belief of mine that there are always two sides to any issue. I've tested this many times and I have found it to ring true. So as you can see, I would be better served by listening to both voices and probably learning some stuff in the process. Today, Reverend Joel is going to talk to us about deep listening. In the coming months, as we deal with the fallout of the pandemic, coupled with the transition we must undertake, the gift of truly listening to each other will be sorely needed. I believe we will do well at it because we covenant and affirm each week to seek the truth in love.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Cannon, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm your Director of Children's and Community Programming. And this morning, I'd like to share a story with you about one of our Unitarian ancestors, Henry David Thoreau, and the still small voice inside of him. Some of you might know that phrase already, the still small voice. You might have heard about it in spirit play, and you might even have heard the still small voice yourself when you're thinking about what to do in a challenging situation, or when you are sad and suddenly you feel comforted. Henry David Thoreau thought about this still small voice sometimes, just like we do. Henry built the cabin he lived in with his own two hands, and this is what it looked like. This is a replica that was built where the original cabin was, so we can see it today. One night, he sat in front of his cabin on one of his 3 chairs, listening to the evening. If you were there, you might have thought there was nothing to listen to. Certainly not podcasts or Spotify. Those wouldn't be around for 100 years or more. There was no one to talk with, no airplanes overhead, and no radio coming from next door. Mr. Emerson was the closest thing he had to a next-door neighbor, and his house was over a mile away, and he didn't have a radio to listen to in any case. Even the natural world was still. No wind rippled the pond, and the birds had stopped singing as night approached. Still, Henry listened for the tiniest sounds, like a small fish breaking the surface of the water and splashing down again, the crackle of a mouse passing through in the leaves, the sound of wings as a crow passed overhead. To him, these miniature sounds were music. Of course, most of the townspeople thought Henry David Thoreau was crazy when he decided to build a tiny cabin from used materials out in Emerson's woodlot by Walden Pond. Why would a promising writer want to move away from society to sit with birds and bugs for company? I like bugs. In fact, Henry enjoyed the company of Emerson and the other thinkers who shared his transcendentalist philosophy. However, to him, the quiet of the pond and the animals and the plants that lived in it and around it provided excellent company. Sometimes, Henry thought, the conversation you learn the most from is the one in which the least is said. As he watched the last rays of light glisten on the pond, Henry thought about the biblical story of the prophet Elijah. We talked about prophets last week, remember? Well, the thing that made this one strange and unusual, the way Reverend Joel described, is that he ran away and wandered in the wilderness for a long time. You see, just like Jonah, Elijah had gone and delivered the messages his God had given him, but people hadn't been very grateful. In fact, they'd been pretty angry, and he was starting to feel like maybe he didn't know what he was doing. So he took shelter in a cave, and there he listened for what God wanted him to do next. Well, while Elijah stood outside his cave, a great wind whipped around the mountains, sending boulders crashing to the ground in the fury of its passing. But God wasn't in the wind. Then an earthquake rattled the mountain with a terrific rumbling. But God wasn't in the earthquake. Then came a fire, sweeping across the rocks and brush outside the cave, red and roaring and grand. If you've been watching the news lately, or you have friends in California or Oregon like me, you know how scary fire can be sometimes. But God wasn't in the fire either. Finally, after all the roaring and crashing, everything became quiet. Elijah stood there shaking, wrapped in his cloak, just waiting. And out of the silence came the still, small voice of God. I'm not at all sure, thought Henry, that I believe in that God of the Bible, the one who chatted with Elijah. But whatever God is, I'm pretty sure I know it better out here in the quiet than I would through any sermon. Maybe God is speaking to me in the small voice of the jumping fish and the mouse rustling in the leaves and the still pond and the stars beginning to peek through the trees. Maybe I hear God when my heart is still and I can listen with my very smallest inner ear. Maybe. And his thoughts drifted off with a small breeze that came and ruffled his hair and rippled across the quiet lake.
Good morning, everyone. We are going to do our joys and sorrows in just a minute, and we're going to move ahead to the next part of our service. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty on this end. Hello, I think we have lost Reverend Joel. Nope, he's here. So we're going to go back to Reverend Joel and skip our joys and concerns for just a minute while I figure out my 3 screens.
We live in a time with a lot of complications to it, so thank you for your forbearance. I want to share with you this meditation by a Unitarian Universalist, Alex Capitan. And as I share with you this meditation, I invite you to remember to breathe. Spirit of the universe, life force that flows through all beings, power beyond our knowing. Help us to see beyond opposites. Help us transcend our desire to know who is it who's like us, who is it who is not. Open us to the knowledge that in everyone listening and watching this morning, there are complexities and diversities of identities. We are beyond black and white. We are not just old and young, not woman and man, poor and rich, uneducated versus educated, disabled versus temporarily abled, gay against straight, ill against healthy, wrong versus right, broken or whole. We are stories, and together and individually we are truth. There's no such thing as opposites in living beings. And so we want to be free from the belief in either or, the belief of opposites that walls us off from one another, from our neighbors, that traps us in a battle of same versus different. We wish to open our minds, deeply listen, truly know one another, and see the kaleidoscopic beauty of the divine. So be it. Blessed be. Amen. And as you meditate, I invite you to pay attention. Don't forget to breathe. and for all that we are, and all that carries us to connection with one another. We give thanks. Amen. So be it. Blessed be.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life a shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Well, I think we just had a crazy week last week. I watched the world around me and I thought, this is a crazy week. Although, as I thought about it, we've had a lot of crazy weeks lately. I think it was crazy to hear the President of the United States screaming as a tactic for a debate. It made me sad. I'm sorry that the President has now COVID-19. I wish he had listened to scientists. He didn't need to get the infection. I think a lot about deep listening as an interim minister. My first goal, meet a congregation and the people of a congregation, is to listen. And if it's not confidential, I reflect what I've heard back to you and back to the congregation as a whole. I'm glad, fortunately, no one at All Souls has needed me to listen to them scream so far. And if you need to, I will. It won't be easy, but of course I would. It's what we do. We listen in ministry. We pay attention. It's what we all do. Ministry is attention. And that's exactly what the word minister means, to pay attention, to listen. In the ancient Latin, the word was ministerium, and it meant to attend. It's a word older than Christianity, and there are similar practices in many of the world's religions. In Buddhism, for example, a similar practice is called mindfulness. It's a practice we also do at All Souls. If we're seeking truth, we have to listen to one another. There's no other way to find it. So we need one another's attention. And we are finding the world needs us to pay attention and to show what attention looks like. Rachel Naomi Raymond, she's an author who writes about working as a chaplain. Her ministry was in a hospital to cancer patients. And much of her writing was about listening. Listening is the heart of doing ministry. She writes, one of my patients told me that when she tried to tell her story, people often interrupted her to tell her that they once had something just like that happen to them. Subtly, this person's pain became a story about someone else. So eventually she stopped talking to most people. It was just too lonely. We connect through listening. When we interrupt what someone is saying to let them know we understand, we move the focus of attention to ourselves. When we just listen, they know we care. I also know that it can be life-saving when we do ministry together. We listen to one another. And we listen to others in the world around us. Writers imprisoned in concentration camps described 70 years ago how important it was to be heard. Any scrap of evidence was sufficient if it suggested that somebody cared. It was so vitally important for survival in the camps to believe that we had not been forsaken. And this is what I understand we do when we pay attention, when we listen, when we are ministers to one another. And I've come to understand it's why sometimes our neighbors actually do scream. Maybe it's the only way they can be heard. 60 years ago, Black Americans demonstrated quietly. They were met with fire hoses, attack dogs, police clubs. 60 years later, things are worse than they were then. Now, any white American is 6 times less likely to be imprisoned for the exact same crime that a Black American would be imprisoned for. And the proportion of Black people exonerated from wrong imprisonment, it's the same. 6 times greater than the exonerations for white folks. I believe in All Souls Covenant. This is why I myself have been on the streets and have screamed. Because I'm minister for justice. It's what we all wish to do. It's part of the covenant we have at All Souls. We're just trying to get our neighbors to see the obvious facts of injustice. Sometimes, though, like last week's presidential debate, screaming is not about being heard or listening. Screaming is making sure that no one can listen. In fact, there are very powerful people in this world who are invested in our being unable to hear one another. People like Vladimir Putin or Americans like the Koch brothers. They don't want us to hear one another. In fact, they have done something called weaponizing information. And they use information like a weapon against us, against our country. We in the United States may not have heard the scream of dropping bombs in recent years, but we're hearing the screams of Americans hating Americans. And that's the sound of our own thought turned into weapons. Weapons of hate. The United States is fighting a real war, but this one is being fought in our own hearts, our own minds. We're being weaponized against one another. Let us not be taught not to listen. And more importantly, let us learn not to listen to fear instead of to love. Don't forget to breathe, by the way. Now is a good time to take a deep breath. Because it's only human to feel fear. And the way fear works in us. In fact, it's interesting. So some years ago, there was a study done of college students and of children, 10-year-old children. And the study showed that college students are far more likely to believe that bad people have a greater chance of getting sick than good people do. Far greater than 10-year-olds. The 10-year-olds know the truth. What happens as we grow that we somehow don't see the truth of the world around us? Again, part of ministry, to be willing to see life is not inherently fair. People in a hospital do not deserve to be there. Fear clouds our thinking. We realize and we see that life can be difficult. Sometimes it is scary. I know I feel fear often. But our fear leads us not to understand our own vulnerability, the fact of the world around us. And we start thinking that people who are sick somehow deserved that illness, or that a person who's handicapped somehow was not as good a person in a previous life, or that people in prison have been always treated fairly. Fear prevents us from ministering. Fear prevents us from paying attention. It censors our ability to see. It stops up our ability to listen. It turns our hands into fists. It clouds our minds, and we can't find the truth. It teaches us, fear teaches us to overlook what is in plain sight. And, as Buddhism or Hinduism teaches, fear teaches us to forget to breathe. And when air doesn't get to your brain, you don't think so well. Well, at least I don't. So breathe. Give enough oxygen to your brain cells. Don't let fear be the guide of our lives. A founder of a Buddhist Zen center in California writes that anything fully attended uproots all of our knowing, carries with it inexhaustible surprises, because life can be surprising. And attention, real ministry, demands that we throw away everything we thought ought to be, the way the world should be. We set that aside. There are no shoulds. Ministry is being willing to look at one another face to face, naked of identities, presuppositions, assumptions, just to be open to whatever comes, even if it's scary. Yeah, the potential for pain, even in listening, it's very real. I don't want to minimize that. And yet, to truly listen is to know the radical truth. This world is beautiful. It's amazing to be alive. Keep breathing. And as I tell you all this, remind you also that fear is not something we can control. Okay, I don't want to feel afraid. I'll just set it aside, put it in a box. Fear is not like that. But what you can do, what any of us can do with fear, is we can see it. Hinduism, Buddhism teach us that the first spiritual task we have, remember to breathe. And having remembered to breathe, to look at our fears. They just are. And that is how fear loses its power over us. To see it and to see why we have it. And to simply choose not to let it have us clutch for the impossible. Chris Abani is a Nigerian writer. He lives and works in the United States now. But in 1984, when he was in Nigeria, he was 16 years old, and he wrote his first novel. This novel was about the Nigerian government, and the government was so afraid of his book and his writing, it put him in jail for 6 months. 16. Bonnie has learned a lot by watching the world. And I want to share some words with you that I think describe the essence of ministry. He writes, "What I've come to learn is that the world is never saved in grand messianic gestures. The world is saved in the simple accumulation of soft, gentle, almost invisible acts of compassion. Everyday acts of compassion. In South Africa, they have a phrase called Ubuntu. Ubuntu comes out of a philosophy that says the only way for me to be human is for you to reflect my humanity back at me. And then he writes, you know, you can steel your heart against any kind of trouble, any kind of horror. But the simple act of kindness from a complete stranger, that will unstitch you. The covenant of all souls, it calls us to be a blessing to each other's lives. The spirit of love, to live it. And to see the world as the beginning of that covenant. The experience of being seen and being heard by compassionate people can unstitch a life. It can save a life, even in faraway places. And tyrants cannot last long when they're seen for what they are. To pay attention to others is to minister even to our own lives. We see what is sacred. We see our own joys and the joys of others. You know, I confess I've worked to build a life based on fortune and success, thinking I'll get some dignity and meaning out of that. But, you know, all of that is something I can lose, that we will all someday lose. Fortunes, successes. I'm coming to learn that the dignity that matters most, the inherent worth and dignity that I truly want, is by opening my life so much that I can listen most deeply, be most deeply connected to others. This will take me a lifetime to perfect. It will take us all a lifetime to perfect. But it brings great gifts. The joy at the miracle of being alive, being the first one. Like the joy of a summer's day truly seen. Like the instinctive joy of a little child knowing and being in the world and looking, just the wonder of looking at it. Like the quiet joy that our elders have when they see the world from great wisdom and years of experience, and they wish to share it with us. And so as we minister, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
Good morning again, everyone. Well, every week we spend just a moment talking about our connection card, which has gone virtual in this age of virtual church. And in fact, that's pretty much the point of our connection card. What are we going to do with our one wild and precious life? And what opportunities are afforded to us here at All Souls to begin that process? So if you look in the chat, you'll see a link that you can click and take a moment to fill out that connection card and to reach out to us by giving us more information about you as a person, by letting us know if you're having any pastoral care needs or if there are any virtual programming ideas that you're just dying to see and don't see yet. We can make those happen. This is also a place where you can ask for more information about our church programs. And there are some specific things that are mentioned there that sometimes help us feel less like we're sitting and watching the news wash over us and more like we're going out into the world and affecting change in a positive way. So I encourage you to take a look at signing up for our Get Out the Vote phone banking through Faith in Indiana. They are holding training, so if you haven't done phone banking before, please don't be nervous. As someone who's done it quite a bit myself, I can tell you it is less scary than it sounds. Eric Morose has been doing a masked meditation on the All Souls grounds, which are really quite beautiful this time of year. So that can be a way to connect with your deeper self and also with nature We also just planted our beautiful All Souls Grove, and until winter begins, we do need some help watering in those trees so that they're prepared for the cold weather and are able to sink their roots as deeply as they can in the interim between now and then. We also hope you'll consider supporting the Million Meal Marathon, which helps to deal with food scarcity and hunger in our community, which, as we know, is an ongoing and to a certain extent a worsening problem in our city this year. Thank you.
Every week, we share the plate offering with an organization that shares our values. We're sharing our collection this morning with the Peace Learning Center of Indianapolis. This organization started in 1997 with a few people concerned about neighborhood and family violence in Indianapolis, with the goal of reducing violence and increasing kindness in our community. It has grown into a community educational institution with programs replicated in 8 US cities and 5 countries. Since its inception, Peace Learning Center has reached more than 210,000 people locally and internationally. Thank you for your generous support of this church and the Peace Learning Center of Indianapolis. And we'll now take a few minutes to let you fill out your connection card and to make your donations if you wish through our PayPal service.
Please join together in singing our congregational hymn.
Each of us ministers to a weary world. Let us go forth now and make this world more loving, more compassionate, and more filled with the grace of a holy, loving presence. Let's go out and be there in every day. Go in peace. Be in peace. We will gather again.